In this series, I'd like to go over what the law has to say about cases of rape and sexual assault. And then I'd like to go through the Bible and interpret what is actually going on in all the instances where it has been alleged that sexual assault and or rape has been recorded in the narrative. This first episode in the series, however, is going to spend some time focusing in on what the law has to say about this subject, specifically in Deuteronomy 22, verses 22 through 29. Everyone has had their airtime with this passage, so I do risk being just another voice crying in the wilderness, but since all I can find, at least online, are hostile emotionalists straw-manning it and faithful Christians just being a little bit embarrassed by it, I figure it's worth the time to risk to put out an interpretation that I haven't quite seen anyone else put out yet. So I'm going to assume the listener has had a basic introduction to the debate viewpoints concerning this passage. And I'll try to quickly allude to competing viewpoints as I work through this passage. But it helps if the listener is already familiar with some of the salient points concerning this passage. Starting at verse 22, Moses tells us that if a man is found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die. The man who was not the husband of the woman, and the woman herself. This verse lays out the principle for us concerning crime and punishment as it relates to adulterous acts. The maximum punishment that might be leveled against one who commits adultery is the death penalty. Now, Moses understands that cases of adultery get complicated when you introduce the idea of sexual crimes into the scenario, which is why he shifts gears to address it in the following verses. But this verse 22 is the baseline standard. We can then apply this principle standard to the following scenarios that Moses puts forth to not only know what the law has to tell us about morality in these situations, but also about the nature of marriage in the process. Verse 23 and 24, if there is a betrothed virgin and a man meets her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death with stones. Now, so far, we haven't veered too far from the original baseline principle set forth for us in verse 22, but Moses is simply setting the stage here. He's setting the stage as he continues on, exploring different counterfactuals. The young woman is to be stoned because she did not cry for help, though she was in the city. And the man, because he violated his neighbor's wife. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. The law here is diving deeper into giving us the reasons for which punishment is implemented. And we should do some more work so we can understand these reasons, because anytime the Bible takes the time to explain the reasoning behind something, it reveals to us more clearly the principles that are being communicated by those commands. Once we best understand those principles, we've gotten to the heart of the law, and we have gained the ability to better and more easily apply the law to many other scenarios where we might find ourselves. The way Moses communicates the law to us, however, is by way of using case examples. He's using illustrations. So before we can understand the principle, we have to do as much as we can beforehand to analyze the letter of the law, so we can extract the principles from its case examples, understand the heart of it, and that way we can live by it in our own lives. Here, Moses says that the reason the woman is punished is because she did not cry for help, even though she was in the city. Now, in the modern Western world, we have a very, very developed literary structure and language, and that language has evolved over a common cultural experience, such that when I say the word consent, everyone from the Western English-speaking world has a generally similar understanding about what that word means in contexts of sexual relationships. But you see, in the ancient world of Moses, there was a different language, a different level of development, and in a different context, such that it wasn't as easily assumed that saying one word would have communicated all the same contexts as it would for us in the modern day. It's very reasonable for Moses to lay out an illustration that better communicates the heart of what he's trying to get at rather than rely on one, single word. And this is wise because the illustration Moses uses, he reuses, again, to further explore elements of crime in marriage, and we'll get to that. But right now, I just want the listener to know that what Moses is doing right now is using illustrations in order to communicate deeper principles. The illustration Moses is using is the example of a woman who screams. The principle Moses is communicating with that illustration is the woman's volition and or resistance to the sexual encounter. Or, in our modern language, Moses is articulating the concept of the woman's consent. I feel obligated to tell the listener that it's extremely important to draw this distinction between the illustration and the principle, and to not confuse or conflate them, because there are hostile and careless readers who do conflate and confuse them. These kinds of people don't know the difference between the letter and the spirit of the law. They don't know the difference between an illustration and the principle. From both self-described scholars and believers alike, they will read this passage and get so wrapped up in the surface level example and think that the only way, biblically speaking, that a woman can express resistance to an advance is by way of screaming, because that's what the legal code addresses in Deuteronomy 22. That's utter foolishness, okay? Because it's that kind of interpretation is exactly the same kind of interpretation that the Pharisees would have had as well. When you begin to place the letter of the law as being over and above the principle that the letter of the law communicates, you have begun to engage in legalism, the kind that was chastised by Jesus himself. Even hostile scholars will fall into this trap where they will challenge what I'm saying because that's supposedly not how an ancient Jew would have understood it. As if that's even provable, I'll always say in response that Jesus was an ancient Jew, and that's how he understood it. I'm not a Jew. I don't interpret the Bible through the eyes of a Pharisaical Sanhedrin court. I'm a Christian. I interpret the Bible through the eyes of Christ, through Jesus. So not only is this distinction I'm making fair, it's superior, as it's taught by Jesus and the prophets. See Micah 6 for an example of a distinction where even in the Old Testament, there's a difference between the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. And I'm drawing the same, distinction between an illustration and a principle. I say all this to drive home the point to the listener that when Moses uses the example of a woman's scream being in the city or in the country, Moses' example is illustrative. It's not normative. It's an illustration of the woman's decision regarding her involvement in the sexual encounter, because the full verse says, she did not cry for help even though she was in the city. That pointing out of her being in the city by Moses is clearly illustrating that a woman who can be easily overpowered by a man still has the ability to cry for help as an act of resistance to the man's advances, with the expectation that other people in the city would come to her aid. So when or if the woman does not express that resistance to the man's advances, she's giving in to his advances. That is the concept of consent Moses is communicating with this illustration, with this example. Now, before some listeners try to come up with other examples of how a woman might be incapacitated and unable to scream, let me stop you right now and remind you that you, again, are confusing the illustration with the principle. I'm glad you can communicate other examples, okay? But all those other examples are getting to the same principle. Don't focus on the example being the normative. That's illustrative. Here, Moses is just using this example. He's not using your example. And Moses gets to use whatever example he wants in his teaching to communicate the woman's consent, the concept of the woman's consent in whatever matters. In these matters, if you can see the ever so obvious concept in the example that Moses has laid forth, then the goal of the illustration is accomplished. And we can then move on to further develop an understanding of this law as we see it applied to the scenario Moses has set forth for us. Now, I've been watching a bunch of Dan McClellan's videos covering this verse. Dan is basically a YouTuber who makes a living, I think, straw-manning the Bible. And he makes a lot of videos about this verse specifically. So I'm going to use his perspective as the representation of the hostile reader.
And so there's no concept of rape in the Bible because rape is about consent, and consent didn't matter in or out of marriage. And this is why some folks even today insist that there's no such thing as marital rape, because marriage was considered the purchasing of exclusive and unilateral rights to the sexual availability of a wife. Now, we see the concept of sexual assault bubbling to the surface most clearly in Deuteronomy 22, verses 23 through 29. And this begins with outlawing adultery, but then moves into what to do if a man sexually assaults a woman who is either betrothed or married, or who is not betrothed or married. And in the case of a woman who is betrothed or married, she's already entered into a contract with a man. She is the exclusive sexual property of a man, even if the marriage has not yet been consummated. And so that contract was considered sacrosanct, and to sexually assault such a woman is to violate the property rights of that man, and that merited the death penalty. Now, we see in verses 28 and 29 that if someone sexually assaults a woman who is neither betrothed nor married, there is no contractual relationship there to violate, and so it does not merit the death penalty. However, there are still property rights that are violated because the woman's father stood to profit from her marriage because he would be paid a bride price. And so sexually, she is the property of her father, and so the penalty is that the man must pay an elevated bride price to the father. But there's a secondary penalty. He then must marry the woman and is never allowed to divorce her. And this reveals the secondary crime of sexual assault. It violates the woman. The verb there is ana. But this has nothing to do with her consent or agency or autonomy. It has to do with her sexual availability to a future spouse within proper Israelite marriage. He has robbed her of that. Because she is now damaged goods sexually, she cannot enter into proper Israelite marriage. And therefore, the penalty is that he must marry her and can never divorce her. And so there are two dimensions to the crime. The first dimension is a property crime against a man, whether the woman's father or husband. And it's also a crime because it renders her damaged goods and it renders her ineligible to participate fully in the rights, the protections, the privileges of proper Israelite marriage within proper Israelite society. At no point does her agency, her consent, or her autonomy enter the question.
One thing he points out in this verse is that the law here is punishing the man who slept with the wife, not because the law cares about the wife's consent or if she was a victim or not, but because the man did harm to his neighbor by sleeping with the neighbor's wife. In other words, it's the husband's grievance the law is concerned about, not the wife's. Verse 24 says, the man is stoned, quote, because he violated his neighbor's wife, end quote. Dan McClellan thinks he's being edgy and original here, but someone might try telling him that this is not only true of biblical marriage law, but it's also true of Western modern marriage law. Of course the law is concerned with the grievance of the husband, because he is the one who has been wronged in this particular example Moses uses. Moses clearly communicates that the wife is consenting to this encounter. So her free will has not been wronged. Her free will has not been violated. There's nothing to address here in terms of punishing a wrong done against her, because she is the one doing the wrong. So of course the law is addressing the grievance of the husband by punishing the man. But Dan's dogma goes too far when he says the law doesn't care about the woman's consent. And it's puzzling to me why he would say this, because we just saw how Moses went to great lengths in his example to articulate the principle that she does have consent to give or not to give. And the following verses directly talk about the law's concern about her grievances specifically in the case where that consent is violated. Verse 25 says, but if in the open country a man meets a woman who is betrothed, and the man seizes her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die, but you shall do nothing to the young woman. She has committed no offense, punishable by death, for this is the case like that of a man attacking and murdering his neighbor. You know, it's almost offensive how Dan will say that the law doesn't care about a woman's consent at all, when this verse is so blatantly clear that it does. The only explanation I can think of as to why Dan McClellan would say that is that he himself is also confusing the difference between the illustration Moses uses and the principle that illustration communicates. One would hope a so-called scholar would grasp a rudimentary concept like that. But perhaps Dan McClellan is not interested in steel-manning the challenges towards his own views. When the woman screams for help in the country, this is Moses' way of illustrating that she did not consent to the encounter. And since that illustration involved nobody coming to her aid, the man is the perpetrator of a crime that's punishable by death. Now, who has grievances in this scenario? Is it the husband of the wife? Perhaps, but only secondarily, because the law already addressed his grievance in the previous scenario. The husband isn't even mentioned in this scenario because the primary grievance is held by the wife. She was the one who was directly wronged. Moses teaches that this is a crime that is to be treated with the same weight as that of a crime of murder. When a man rises to strike and murder his neighbor, so too is this scenario when the man assaults to rape this woman. That means that Moses here is prescribing the death penalty for rape. And in other laws where the death penalty has forgivable conditions under certain circumstances, it's worth remembering that God declared the death penalty for a criminal should not be ransomed in cases when the criminal murdered another innocent life. If man shed innocent blood, by man shall his blood be shed. And when Moses compares rape to murdering your neighbor, he's saying that by man that rapist's blood is to be shed. I should add on here that this is talking about cases of rape. This is not talking about cases of regret. In other parts of the Bible, the law teaches that the same crime that would have befallen an accused should befall the accuser if it's found out after investigation that the accuser lied. And so transitive property, that means that if the woman falsely accuses a man of rape, it should be treated as an attempt on his very life. So in every case, thorough investigations should be implemented to find out the truth, and both the accused and the accuser should know what's at stake. I want to get back to my original point. Between these two scenarios we've gone over, Moses has set up a pattern for us on how to interpret the law. As we go through the law, we see that the law is directly addressing repercussions that are directly based on who specifically is being wronged. If you want to understand what is happening in the scenarios Moses is illustrating, just figure out whose grievance is the Bible addressing, who has been wronged. And when you figure that out, it's a lot easier to see the principle of the law being made manifest. In verse 23 and 24, the wronged party is the husband, not the wife, not the perpetrator. And the law directs punishments in such a way that the justice is satisfied to address his grievance, because the sin being addressed here is adultery. On the other hand, in verses 25 and 27, the wronged party is the wife. And the law directs punishments very carefully here to satisfy justice such that her specific grievances are avenged by justice in the punishment of the perpetrator. Because the sin being addressed here is rape. Now, let's move on to the next verse, verse 28. If a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has violated her. He may not divorce her all his days. Let's focus on the beginning of this verse. If a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found out. Let's talk about this. The debate over this controversial passage is mainly over if Moses is describing a rape scenario or not in this particular case example. Because when the English says that the man seizes her and lies with her, that's the type of language in our modern trained ears that would invoke thoughts of physical overpowering. Christians are on both sides of this debate. Some say that this is the case of rape, and others say that it isn't. Briefly, let me just quickly lay out the reasons both sides use so I can show you why I think both of them are weak before I present my own case. The side that says that the woman is definitely raped will point out that the word seize, to seize her, in this biblical Hebraic study on it, from a survey of examples, it'll show how it's used in other parts of the Bible to say that it always means forcefully overtaking. The word here for to seize is translated from the Hebrew tafas. And it's used in different parts of the scripture to communicate things like grabbing a weapon in Jeremiah 46:9, or capturing a city in Joshua 8:8, immediately arresting someone in 1 Kings 13:4. And in each of these cases, the rape interpretists, as I'll call them, say that it's consistently used to communicate a violent handling of the object that the verb is applied to. On the other hand, the consent interpretists do not have a very good answer for this, except to say that the word tafas is just not the same word in Hebrew used a few verses prior in verse 25, where the rapist seizes the woman via the word hazak. And in this scenario, the rape scenario, Moses is describing what both sides agree is definitely a rape scenario. So the fact that Moses shifts his lexicon away from that word hazak used in the rape scenario to a different word, tafas, in this scenario, should indicate to readers that Moses is purposefully shifting away from describing rape scenarios anymore and is focusing on something else. The rape interpretists respond to that not having a very good answer at all. They just say that Moses is simply trying to be more appealing as an author by adding some word variety to his written literature. I think it's unconvincing, to say the least. And while the use of the word tafas is used throughout the Bible in contexts where forceful overpowering is part of the narrative, I think it's a mistake to associate the word with this force factor because of the times when the word is used in a way that is clearly not about overpowering force, such as in Isaiah 3, which speaks of a prophetic moment of desperation in Israel, where Isaiah says, "For a man will take hold of his brother." That take hold right there, tafas. A man will take hold of his brother. The same word that we see in the previous verse where the man seizes the virgin, tafas. A man will take hold of his brother in the house of his father, saying, "You have a cloak, you shall be our leader, and this heap of our ruins shall be under your rule." In that day he will speak out, saying, "I will not be a healer. In my house there is neither bread nor cloak. You shall not make me leader of the people." This, in Isaiah 3, is a clear example where tafas is used to describe one person taking hold of his brother in haste and even under social pressure. Yet the brother is not physically overpowered because in this example, the brother simply denies the man's taking of him and his request. He says, "No, I'm not going to be your leader." And that's it. So I think that the word tafas is more accurately understood as a manner of taking hold, not with overpowering force or violence, but rather with haste or urgency, not necessarily with overpowerment. And when you look back at the survey of how it's used, you'll find that tafas is consistently used in those contexts, a taking of someone with haste or urgency. I can see why many might confuse the concept of urgency with overpowerment, but they are not one and the same thing. It's very possible to be hasty or urgent without something being physically overpowering. In the case of the virgin who was in the city, a nefarious suitor would definitely have to work with haste in his seduction if he wanted to seduce a young virgin before she could consummate her betrothal with her rightful husband. And so that's the illustration Moses uses here in this example. Meanwhile, the consent interpretists will just about always point to the phrase, quote, "and they are found out," as wording that they think is connotated with the couples being discovered as some kind of proof that the woman was privy to the encounter. The rape interpretists would say, and I myself agree with them, that this approach of gleaning too much out of that phrasing, "and they are found out," is unconvincing. There is nothing in the wording of "they are found out" that indicates consent or non-consent to be at play in this scenario. And furthermore, it's not difficult at all to imagine scenarios where a rape victim decides she wants to keep the crime that happened to her a secret. Just because she doesn't want to report it does not mean she was not raped. I mean, the example of Tamar in the story of David's kingdom being raped and yet keeping quiet about all of that, keeping quiet about it is biblical proof of the realism of this. And so for someone to find them out is just as realistic if it was the case of rape or not the case of rape. So the consent interpretists are grasping for straws on that front. And both sides are grasping for straws when they both make arguments from silence at each other. The consent interpretists will say, well, the passage doesn't say she resisted. as if that's supposed to be evidence she consented. And the rape interpretists will say the passage doesn't say she consented, as if that's supposed to be evidence that she was raped. So you see how both of them are making the exact same argument about what is not said in the passage, and then they fill the void with their own biased injections into the scenario, but both sides are terribly wrong with approaching the Bible this way. My own view on this is that there simply is an unspoken assumption that everyone is making when they are interpreting this passage, because in these different scenarios that Moses offers, he has a woman who is either betrothed or who is unbetrothed, or an unbetrothed virgin, and readers think that the fulcrum upon which these laws should be categorically understood is through the lens of the betrothal status or virginity status of the woman in each of these scenarios. I think that's wrong. I think it's unscrupulous to read it that way. Categorizing each law in this manner places an illustrative device as being over and above, more important, the principle that Moses is trying to communicate with that device. To place the illustration over and above the principle inevitably will lead to contradictory conclusions, which is why there is ample disagreement over this passage. I'd like to submit to the listener a different way of interpreting these passages, which already follows the pattern that Moses has set up. Instead of treating the virginity status of the woman in these passages as the fulcrum principle by which the rest of the ethic is gleaned, the reader should figure out first who in each example has a grievance to air. Who has been wronged in each example? Who's the victim? Who does the law try to make right the wrongs done them? If you do this, you do identify the fulcrum by which the entire passage should be understood. And not only does it clear up the tensions and conflicts that previous interpretations had to deal with, but it also extrapolates even further wisdom from the ethic that Moses is teaching. We already saw in the first example how the husband was the victim of the adulterous wife. And so penalty falls on both adulterous actors who perpetrated harm on the husband as a means to satisfy justice. In the second example, the wife was identified as the victim, and so penalty befell only the rapist. Now, in the example of verse 28, who is the identified victim? Who has been wronged such that the law is seeking to compensate? The payment that is made to the father is a clear identifier that Moses is addressing the wrongs done the father by the behaviors of his daughter and the strange man's affair. And when we understand that Moses' focus in this particular example is to recognize wrongs done against the father, it becomes clear that rape couldn't have been the point in the illustration Moses put forth. We already have a legal ethic from Moses in verse 26 about how legal punishment is to be distributed in the case of rape. And in that verse, the law does not overtly recognize the woman's head as being a victim entitled to any compensation. Yet in verse 28, the law does overtly recognize the woman's head as a victim entitled to compensation. Furthermore, the treatment of convicted rapists in verse 26 would necessarily apply to the man in verse 28 if it was true that Moses was presenting a rape scenario. But it doesn't. On the contrary, verse 28 claims the man lives to pay the father and to marry the daughter. Moses says that this is because the man has violated or, quote, humbled her, which is simply a euphemism for meaning that the man deflowered her or that he had sex for the first time with her. Some hostile readers will try to twist that Hebrew term and spin it into meaning that the man forced himself onto her. But this is an absolutely indefensible position because every time the Hebrew word is used in the context of sexual relationships, it always is in the context of a virgin having sex for the first time, not involuntary intercourse. The word in general means to humble, which is the euphemistic part being communicated when applied to sexual contexts. The best example to prove this is verse 24 of this very chapter, which teaches if you find a betrothed virgin who is committing adultery with a man who is other than her husband voluntarily, then both are punishable, particularly the man because he has violated or humbled, same word, The woman, the exact same word used in verse 29, yet used in a scenario where the woman is unquestionably voluntary in the act, proving that verse 29 cannot possibly be invoking that word as a word to denote rape. Now, there's more nuances I'd like to unpack from these passages, such as the word studies about tafas and hazak and how they are used, but my plan is to go back to this Deuteronomy chapter throughout this series to reference it for our understanding of the different rape and sexual assault scenarios found in the narrative portions of Scripture. And so I'll save more detailed commentary on this chapter for those episodes. But I'd like to end this episode with one more point that adds illumination and clarity to the overall ethic Moses is getting at. I imagine some listeners are following along with my thinking process in seeing that the rape described in verse 26's example is demonstrating that punishment for rape falls on the shoulders of the rapist, regardless of if the victim is betrothed or not. But they still might struggle with, if that was true, why does Moses describe the woman in that scenario as being betrothed? What's the point of even explaining that she's betrothed if it has nothing to do with the justice due her from being victimized by a perpetrator? The answer to this can be clearly seen once you realize that Moses is actually communicating not one, but two legal principles in verses 25 through 27, when he uses the example of a betrothed woman being the victim of rape. When Moses says that rape is like murder, he's actually only identified the second legal principle, namely that the woman is a victim of rape and that the rapist is guilty. But in the sentence immediately before that, Moses addresses the first legal principle. Moses says in this scenario that the woman has committed no offense punishable by death. He's saying the woman is innocent. Now that's different. That's a different law being talked about. Adultery is not the same crime as rape. And Moses is saying that not only is the woman a victim of the crime of rape, but she's also innocent of the crime of adultery. Two different laws being addressed and her relation to it. What does that tell us? It tells us that the covenant of marriage that this woman has with her husband has not been violated. As evil as some men are in their efforts to violate the body, the woman is resistant to those advances, and her oath to that covenant bond remains intact. And if it's intact, the marriage covenant remains bound. Moses says, you are to do nothing to the woman on account of the crime of adultery. And that necessarily means precluding any thought of divorce from her on account of this crime that she has endured. I think this is a fascinating nugget from the law because it reveals that marriage covenants are maintained by one's spiritual commitment to the marriage, even if bodily commitment is violated against the will of the one trying to maintain that commitment. A spouse's spiritual commitment is consummated by the act of sex. However, when a spouse is forced against their commitments to bodily violate that marriage union, Moses says the marriage covenant is really and truly unscathed, meaning there is something else holding up and maintaining that marriage covenant beyond just mere physical sexual fidelity. Now, there's a school of thought in Christian circles. I believe the school is called one flesh theology, but I'm not for sure, and I know it's a minority viewpoint, but regardless, it believes that the act of sex itself, absent of oaths of commitment, is the only thing necessary to form marriage covenants. And I think this law here from Moses debunks that viewpoint. Otherwise, Moses would not have written the law as he did. If a woman was betrothed to be married to a man, and a different man rapes her, whereby she's no longer a virgin, this particular school of thought would have to conclude, based on their thinking, that the victimized woman should be married now to her rapist, even though Moses is saying the opposite here. One of the appeals that this school makes to defend their claim is that in the book of 2 Samuel, after Amnon had raped his half-sister Tamar, Amnon begins to despise Tamar and wants to send her away from him. But Tamar objects to this by saying, "No, my brother, for this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me." So what Tamar is saying here is that Amnon would be committing a greater evil than rape by sending her away now that he has already sexually consummated with her. And this school of thought thinks that this plea, this desperate, traumatized plea from Tamar, is proof that a victim of rape is bound by marriage to her rapist. I think this school of thought I'm talking about is gravely mistaken and completely misreading the text of that chapter. And I'll get to the specifics of Tamar in a future episode, but right now, all I need is to see Moses' words here in Deuteronomy to figure out that their interpretation is in full contradiction of God's law. Moses says that the rapist is akin to a murderer, and that the woman is innocent of any crime of adultery, such that nothing should be done against her in treating her as if she has been guilty of adultery. And since the woman in Moses' illustration did not legally commit any crime which is grounds for divorce or any crime which violates her betrothal, it necessarily means her betrothal and or her covenant marriage remains intact. And it would actually be unjust for her husband to divorce her or send her away on those grounds. A one-flesh theologian is squarely at odds with Moses on that issue. Now, we will visit that topic again, especially in regards to Tamar, but suffice it now to say that in Deuteronomy, it is necessary for Moses to use a betrothed woman in his illustration in order to communicate those legal points. If Moses would have used the case of a virgin in verses 25 through 27, who's unbetrothed, he would not have been able to articulate the factor of innocence in contexts where adultery is in question. So let's review real quick. In verses 23 through 27, Moses reiterates the sinfulness of adultery and then uses illustrations that teach about the concept of consent and how that renders the victim of rape innocent of any crime while condemning the rapist to capital punishment. Then, verses 28 and 29, I argue, are not illustrations of rape and therefore are not teaching that rape victims need to marry their rapists. Verses 28 and 29 are teaching that any potential suitor of a virgin woman is required to not circumnavigate the virgin's father and to respect his authority as he expresses his sexual interests, and that if he doesn't, he's required to pay hefty fines and is obliged to committing to this girl. The passage says that the man is to take her on as his wife. Now, many Christians don't really give much thought to how Moses is wording the obligation that the man has here. Most Christians would say that to marry a woman is by definition to be obliged to not plan on divorcing her. So the question would be, what is the point of Moses saying, you are not allowed to divorce her all your days? If Moses already said in the previous sentence that he's required to marry her, doesn't marry her at least imply that you should not plan on divorcing her? Well, in my other series that I go over the Bible called Wives and Concubines in Biblical Law, I showed how the Hebrew word for wife is Isha. And Isha is the exact same Hebrew word for just the general term for woman. And the verse doesn't literally say that the man is obliged to marry her. Rather, it says he is obliged to take her on as his Isha, or to take her on as his woman. But to take her on as his woman could just mean that he could take her on as his concubine. And since concubines could be divorced from or sent away or broken up with without violating the law, the suitor could plan to be with the woman for a short while and then later on break up with her. But Moses prevents that scenario from happening by saying that the man is to take her on as his woman and is not to send her away for the rest of his life. Which at that point, at that definitive point, it becomes known from Moses that Moses is describing here that the man is obligated to take on this woman as his wife in a marriage covenant and not just simply as a concubine.